In the humid summer of 2016, the city of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, stood still under the oppressive heat. The quiet, tree-lined streets of the Riverbend neighborhood were home to some of the wealthiest families in the city, including Nia Turner, a 35-year-old mother of two and wife to prominent defense attorney Frank Turner. Their grand, white-columned house sat on a sprawling lot, the epitome of Southern elegance and charm. On the surface, everything in Nia's life appeared flawless. Her husband was successful. Her children, Olivia and Jackson, were well-behaved, and her social calendar was full of charity galas and elite gatherings. But beneath the glossy veneer of her life, Nia felt suffocated. Frank's work as an attorney demanded long hours, leaving Nia alone for days at a time in their mansion. Her life had become a monotonous routine of household chores and superficial social engagements. No matter how many times she smiled at cocktail parties or attended yoga classes, the emptiness inside her only grew. She was tired of the lies, of pretending that her life was everything she had once dreamed of. Frank's absence had become a permanent fixture, and his coldness when he was home reminded her that their marriage was no longer about love. It was about appearances. One fateful day in mid-July, as she wandered through the art district downtown, Nia stumbled upon a gallery hosting an exhibition by Monique Jones, a talented young artist from New Orleans. Monique's work was raw and provocative, filled with emotion that seemed to leap from the canvas. As Nia stood in front of one particularly intense painting, a swirl of bold colors and jagged lines, she heard a soft voice behind her. "Do you like it?" the voice asked. Nia turned to see Monique herself, a striking woman in her early 30s, with short, coiled hair and piercing eyes. She was dressed in black, her confident demeanor immediately drawing Nia in. They talked briefly about the artwork, but something unspoken passed between them, a magnetic pull that Nia couldn't ignore. From that moment, Monique became a regular part of Nia's life. They started meeting for coffee and lunches, their conversations growing more intimate with each encounter. Monique was unlike anyone Nia had ever met, fiercely independent, passionate, and unafraid to challenge societal norms. She introduced Nia to a world of freedom and desire, a world where she didn't have to be the perfect wife and mother. For the first time in years, Nia felt alive. As their friendship deepened, so did the tension between them. Nia found herself increasingly drawn to Monique, her touch, her voice, the way she looked at her. It was more than admiration, it was longing. Nia's world began to blur between the life she had built and the life she now craved. She knew it was dangerous, but she couldn't help herself. Monique had awakened something inside her that she thought had died long ago. One evening, after a particularly intense conversation about art and love, Monique invited Nia back to her studio, a modest but cozy space in an old warehouse. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension as Monique poured them both a glass of wine. As the night wore on, their conversations turned more personal, their touches lingering just a little too long. It wasn't long before Monique leaned in and kissed Nia softly, and in that moment, Nia's entire world shifted. The kiss was electric, and Nia, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions she had suppressed for so long, kissed her back. The passion between them ignited, and they spent the night together in a blur of desire and need. For Nia, it was an escape from her life, a moment of pure freedom that she had never experienced before. But as the sun rose the next morning, reality crashed down around her. She had crossed a line, one she could never uncross. Back at home, Nia tried to push her affair with Monique out of her mind, but the guilt gnawed at her. Every time Frank asked her a simple question or the children hugged her, the weight of her secret pressed down harder. Frank, oblivious to Nia's internal turmoil, continued with his life as usual, working late nights, attending high-profile trials, and leaving Nia to her own devices. But things quickly took a darker turn. The more time Nia spent with Monique, the more reckless she became. She started sneaking out in the middle of the night, meeting Monique in secluded places around town, abandoned parks, hidden alleyways, anywhere they could be alone. Each encounter brought more passion, but also more danger. Nia felt like she was living on the edge, her emotions swinging wildly between elation and despair. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop. Frank, ever the sharp attorney, began to notice subtle changes in Nia's behavior. She was more distant, her answers to his questions vague and evasive. She no longer seemed interested in their family life, often disappearing for hours without explanation. Frank's suspicions grew, and he started watching her more closely, though he said nothing at first. As the weeks passed, Nia's affair with Monique became more consuming. Monique, growing bolder, began to demand more of Nia's time and attention. She wanted Nia to leave Frank, to stop pretending and live her life openly. But Nia, torn between her passion for Monique and her loyalty to her family, couldn't make that decision. The tension between them grew, and Monique's once gentle demeanor turned possessive and controlling. Meanwhile, Frank's investigation into Nia's secret life was intensifying. He began discreetly following her, tracking her movements, and looking for any signs of infidelity. What he uncovered shocked him, but it wasn't enough to confront her yet. He needed proof, something concrete that would explain why his wife had become a stranger. The affair was no longer just a dangerous game for Nia, it was a ticking time bomb. Her once picture-perfect life was unraveling, and with each passing day she was drawn deeper into Monique's world, a world of dark passion, hidden desires, and simmering tension that could explode at any moment. The humid air of Baton Rouge felt heavier as summer dragged on. With each passing day, Nia felt herself sinking deeper into the web of lies she had spun. Her affair with Monique had become an addiction, an escape she desperately needed, but one that threatened to destroy everything she held dear. At home, the tension between her and Frank was palpable. His once distant attitude had shifted. He was asking more questions, watching her closely, and Nia could feel his suspicion growing like a storm on the horizon. One night, as Nia slipped out of the house under the cover of darkness, Frank stood by the window, his eyes narrowing as he watched her car pull out of the driveway. She had said she was going to a friend's house, but Frank knew better. He had followed her before, trailing her to downtown bars and deserted streets where she would disappear for hours. His gut told him that something was very wrong, and as an attorney, he trusted his instincts. Nia drove to Monique's studio, the thrill of their secret meeting still sending shivers down her spine. But there was also fear now, fear of being caught, fear of what would happen if Frank discovered the truth. Monique, always bold and daring, had grown more possessive over the past few weeks. She had started making demands. She wanted more of Nia's time, more commitment. Nia knew she was playing a dangerous game, but every time she tried to pull back, Monique would lure her in again with her intense passion and emotional manipulations. This night was no different. As soon as Nia walked through the door, Monique was on her, pulling her into a kiss filled with heat and urgency. But there was something different in Monique's eyes, something darker. "You need to make a decision," Monique whispered, her voice laced with frustration. "I'm tired of hiding. I can't do this anymore." Nia's heart raced. She wasn't ready for this conversation. "I can't just leave him," Nia replied, pulling away. "He's the father of my children. You don't understand." Monique's expression hardened. "I understand perfectly. You're too scared to live your life the way you want. You're hiding behind your family, but you're miserable, Nia. Don't you see that?" Nia shook her head, the weight of Monique's words crushing her. She didn't want to admit it, but Monique was right. She was miserable. Yet, the thought of breaking her family apart terrified her. As the tension in the room thickened, Nia's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it. Frank's name lit up the screen. Panic surged through her. She hadn't expected him to call this late, and her hands trembled as she hit the button to silence it. Monique noticed. "You're lying to him. You're lying to me. How long do you think you can keep this up?" Nia's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she couldn't keep living this double life, but the thought of losing her children, her reputation, and everything she had worked so hard to build was too much to bear. "I need more time," Nia whispered, her voice barely audible. Monique's face twisted in frustration. "Time? Time for what? For him to figure everything out and throw you out of his life? Is that what you want?" Nia stood frozen, her mind racing. She hadn't thought about the consequences of her actions. Not fully. And now, they were catching up with her faster than she could manage. Meanwhile, Frank had grown restless. His suspicions about Nia's infidelity were no longer just suspicions. They were becoming fact. His investigations, though still subtle, had uncovered patterns. Nia's sudden disappearances, her vague excuses, her emotionally distant behavior, none of it added up. And now, watching her lie to him so effortlessly made his blood boil. Frank decided it was time to take things further. He began to look into Nia's phone records, paying special attention to her messages and calls. Though she had been careful, Frank's legal expertise helped him navigate the murky waters of digital privacy. He found traces of conversations she had deleted, little breadcrumbs that led him to the name Monique Jones. At first it didn't make sense, but the more he dug, the clearer it became. Monique wasn't just a friend. She was the person Nia was sneaking off to see late at night. The realization hit Frank like a punch to the gut. His wife, his partner of over a decade, was involved in a passionate affair with another woman. Anger and betrayal washed over him in waves, but he knew he had to stay calm. If Nia was keeping secrets, so would he. Frank wasn't a man to be blindsided. He needed to be methodical, to gather evidence before making his next move. Back at Monique's studio, the tension between the two women reached a breaking point. Monique wasn't just pushing for Nia to make a choice anymore, she was demanding it. "If you don't leave him, I will tell him everything," Monique said, her voice cold and determined. Nia's eyes widened in shock. "You can't do that," she said, her voice shaking. "You'll ruin everything." Monique's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You've already ruined everything, Nia. You're just too afraid to admit it." Nia's world began to spin. The stakes had never been higher. Monique's threat wasn't idle. She was serious, and Nia knew that if Frank found out this way, there would be no coming back from it. Her children, her home, her life, it would all be destroyed in an instant. Frank, unaware of the heated conversation between Nia and Monique, was busy laying out his plan. He needed concrete proof before he confronted her, proof that would not only expose the affair, but ensure that he had the upper hand. He wasn't going to let Nia walk away from this without consequences. As an attorney, Frank knew how to play the long game, and he intended to make sure that Nia paid for her betrayal. But little did Frank know, the game had already spun out of control, and soon, all three of them would be caught in a whirlwind of lies, betrayal, and violence that none of them could escape. The sweltering heat of Baton Rouge bore down like a relentless weight as the tension between Nia and Monique reached a boiling point. Weeks had passed since Monique had issued her ultimatum, and Nia could feel the pressure mounting from all sides. Monique's demands had grown more intense, more desperate, and with each passing day, Nia felt like she was suffocating under the weight of her lies. Her once secret affair had become a prison of its own. Monique's free-spirited nature, which had once drawn Nia in like a moth to a flame, now felt like an ever-tightening noose around her neck. Monique wasn't just asking her to choose anymore, she was demanding it. She wanted Nia to leave Frank, to abandon her life, and start fresh with her. But Nia knew that wasn't an option. She couldn't just walk away from her children, from everything she had built. But how could she continue living this double life? One evening, as the oppressive heat clung to the city like a second skin, Nia met Monique in the usual spot, her studio. The air was thick with unspoken tension as Monique paced the room, her frustration palpable. Nia could feel it, the shift in Monique's behavior, the way her demands were no longer veiled in affection, but hardened by impatience. "You can't keep running from this, Nia," Monique snapped, her voice sharper than usual. "I've been patient, I've given you time, but I'm done waiting." Nia felt her heart race as she sat frozen on the couch. She didn't know how to respond. Monique's words were like daggers, cutting deep into her growing sense of dread. She could feel the walls closing in around her, and for the first time, Nia began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. "I told you I just need more time," Nia whispered, her voice trembling. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were hollow. Monique stopped pacing and stared at her, her eyes cold. "Time? You've had time, Nia. I'm starting to think you're never going to leave him." Nia's throat tightened, and her mind raced with thoughts of her children, Olivia and Jackson. She couldn't just abandon them. But Monique wouldn't accept that answer. "I can't leave them," Nia pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "You don't understand." Monique's face twisted with anger. "No, Nia. You're the one who doesn't understand. You're lying to everyone. You're lying to me. And if you think you can keep doing this, you're wrong. I've been too patient with you." Nia's stomach churned with fear as she realized Monique's patience had run out. This was no longer a relationship fueled by passion and excitement. It had become a dangerous game of control and manipulation. Monique wanted more than Nia was willing to give, and Nia could feel the threat hanging over her like a storm ready to break. At home, Frank's investigation had taken a more serious turn. He had followed Nia one evening, carefully trailing her car as she drove to Monique's studio. He parked a few streets away and waited, watching from a distance as Nia disappeared inside the building. Frank's mind churned with anger, betrayal, and a burning need for answers. He had pieced together enough to know what was happening. His wife was having an affair. But he needed more than just suspicion. He needed solid proof. Frank began documenting Nia's every move. He installed tracking software on her phone and hired a private investigator to gather more information on Monique. What he uncovered was shocking. Monique had a history of volatile relationships, leaving a trail of emotional destruction in her wake. It wasn't just her relationship with Nia that concerned Frank. It was the way Monique seemed to manipulate those around her, using her charm and passion to bend people to her will. Frank knew that Nia was in over her head, but he couldn't just confront her without undeniable evidence. Late one night, Frank received a call from the private investigator. The news was worse than he had anticipated. Monique wasn't just pushing Nia to leave him. She had been following Frank as well, keeping tabs on his movements. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just an affair anymore. It was a dangerous power struggle, and Frank was at the center of it. Meanwhile, Monique's behavior became more erratic. She started showing up unexpectedly at Nia's house, waiting for her outside when she knew Frank wasn't home. Monique's text messages became more demanding, more threatening. Nia couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. She knew that if she didn't make a choice soon, Monique would take matters into her own hands. "You have to leave him," Monique whispered during one of their late-night meetings. Her voice was soft, but there was an underlying menace in her tone. "I won't wait forever. If you don't tell him, I will." Nia's blood ran cold. She knew Monique wasn't bluffing. The threat of exposure loomed larger every day, and Nia could feel her life unraveling at the seams. The pressure was unbearable. She was living in constant fear of losing her children, fear of losing her reputation, and most terrifying of all, fear of Monique. The woman she had once seen as a liberator had become a dangerous presence in her life, one she could no longer control. Nia tried to placate Monique, promising her that she would tell Frank, but deep down, she knew she couldn't do it. Monique's jealousy and erratic behavior were spiraling out of control, and Nia felt trapped between two impossible choices: continue the affair and risk losing everything, or end it and face Monique's wrath. Frank, unaware of the danger brewing in Nia's life, was finalizing his plan. He had gathered enough evidence to confront her, but he wanted to ensure that when the time came, he would have the upper hand. He wasn't just going to expose her affair, he was going to use it to his advantage. Frank knew that if the truth came out on his terms, he could control the narrative, protect his children, and make sure that Nia paid for her betrayal. But what Frank didn't know was that Monique was one step ahead of him. The days passed in a blur of anxiety and paranoia. Nia couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Monique's threats had become more direct. "If you don't tell him by the end of this week, I will," Monique had texted her one evening. Nia knew the time for delaying was over. Monique was serious, and she wasn't going to wait any longer. With no other options, Nia decided that she would break it off with Monique. She couldn't risk losing her family, but she also knew that ending things wouldn't be easy. Monique wasn't the type to let go easily. Nia could see the danger in her eyes, the way Monique's possessiveness had taken over. It was no longer just an affair, it was an obsession. And obsessions didn't end peacefully. As summer gave way to fall in Baton Rouge, the days grew shorter, but the tension in Nia's life only intensified. Monique's ultimatum hung over her head like a dark cloud, and the weight of her secrets had become unbearable. Frank's suspicions were growing stronger, and Nia could feel the noose tightening around her. Every conversation with him felt like a trap, every glance heavy with unspoken questions. Nia knew she was running out of time. One morning, Nia woke up to an empty house. Frank hadn't come home the night before, but she hadn't thought much of it. He often stayed late at work. However, by noon his phone was still off, and none of his colleagues had heard from him. Panic slowly started to set in. Frank was always meticulous, always in control. He never left without letting her know where he was going. Nia tried calling him again, her heart pounding in her chest. Still no answer. By late afternoon, the anxiety that had been building all day finally erupted into full-blown terror. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. Frank had vanished without a trace. She paced the kitchen, her mind racing with fear and confusion. What if Frank had discovered everything? What if he had left her, unable to confront her betrayal? But as the hours passed and the sun dipped below the horizon, a more sinister thought crept into her mind. What if Monique had something to do with his disappearance? That evening, after putting the kids to bed, Nia drove to Monique's studio. Her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her thoughts spinning out of control. She couldn't shake the feeling that Monique was involved, but why? What would she have to gain by making Frank disappear? When Nia arrived at the studio, Monique was waiting for her, a glass of wine in hand. The calm expression on her face only heightened Nia's anxiety. As she entered the room, the familiar tension between them filled the air, but tonight it felt different, darker, more dangerous. "Where is he?" Nia blurted out, unable to contain her fear any longer. Monique raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "What are you talking about?" Nia's voice cracked with panic. "Frank, he's gone. He didn't come home last night, and no one has seen him. What did you do?" Monique's eyes glinted with something Nia couldn't quite place, something cold and calculated. "I didn't do anything, Nia," she said slowly, placing her glass down on the table. "But maybe he found out about us. Maybe he couldn't handle the truth and decided to leave." Nia felt her blood run cold. There was something off about the way Monique said it, as if she were planting the idea in Nia's head. She tried to stay calm, but the fear gnawed at her. Was Monique telling the truth? Or was this part of her twisted game? "I don't believe you," Nia whispered, her voice trembling. "You've been pushing me to leave him for months, and now he's just gone?" Monique's expression darkened. "Maybe it's for the best, don't you think? Now we can be together without all this lying and sneaking around?" Nia's stomach churned. There was no remorse in Monique's voice, no concern for the man who had vanished without a trace. Nia backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't the woman she had fallen for. This was someone else entirely. Monique's possessiveness had morphed into something much more dangerous, and Nia suddenly realized just how deep she had been pulled into this nightmare. Days turned into weeks, and Frank was still missing. The police had been called, but there were no leads. His car remained in the garage, his wallet and keys untouched. Nia couldn't stop the growing sense of dread that consumed her. The guilt of her affair weighed heavily on her, but it was the uncertainty of Frank's fate that haunted her. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and every time the phone rang, her heart leaped into her throat, expecting the worst. The police had begun to question her more thoroughly. Where was she the night Frank disappeared? Did they have any marital issues? Nia did her best to remain calm, but her lies were catching up to her. She told the detectives that their marriage was fine, that Frank had been under a lot of stress with work, but they didn't seem convinced. As the investigation dragged on, the pressure became unbearable. Nia found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, paranoid that Monique was watching her, waiting for her to break. Monique continued to call and text, acting as if nothing was wrong. She insisted that this was their chance to be together, free from the constraints of Nia's old life. But Nia could no longer trust her. Every word that came out of Monique's mouth felt like another lie, another manipulation. One evening, Nia received a message from Monique that chilled her to the core. "Come to the house by the river. We need to talk." The house by the river was Monique's secluded getaway, a place they had gone to in secret more times than Nia could count. But now, the thought of going there filled her with dread. She knew she had to go. Monique was losing control, and Nia needed answers. When Nia arrived at the house, the sun was setting, casting an eerie glow over the water. Monique stood at the front door, her silhouette backlit by the fading light. Nia's heart raced as she approached, every instinct telling her to turn around and leave. But she couldn't. She needed to know the truth. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Monique sat down, her demeanor calm but cold. Nia could feel the danger lurking just beneath the surface. "What happened to Frank?" Nia demanded, her voice trembling. Monique smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I told you, he's gone. Maybe he left, maybe he didn't. Does it matter?" Nia's fear boiled over into anger. "Of course it matters! He's my husband, the father of my children. What did you do to him?" Monique's smile faded, and her eyes hardened. "He was in the way, Nia. You couldn't see it, but I did. Now you're free. Isn't that what you wanted?" Nia's mind spun. Monique's words confirmed her worst fears. Something had happened to Frank, and Monique had played a part in it. She had to get out of there. She stood up abruptly, her hands shaking. "I'm leaving," Nia said, her voice barely steady. "This is over." But Monique's face twisted with rage. "You're not going anywhere," she hissed. "You're mine, Nia. You always have been." Nia backed toward the door, her pulse racing. She had to escape, but Monique was blocking her path. As she turned to flee, Monique lunged at her, grabbing her arm with terrifying force. Nia struggled, her fear turning to pure survival instinct as she tried to break free. In the chaos, Monique lost her grip, but as she fell back, her head hit the edge of the coffee table with a sickening thud. Nia stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. Monique lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath her head. Nia's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the lifeless body. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen. She had made a terrible mistake, but there was no going back now. The eerie silence of the house by the river was broken only by the sound of Nia's ragged breathing as she stared at Monique's lifeless body on the floor. Her mind raced, unable to comprehend what had just happened. This wasn't supposed to end like this. Monique had been the woman who had set her free, awakened something inside her, but now she lay dead at Nia's feet, a pool of blood slowly spreading across the floor. Nia's hands trembled uncontrollably as she stumbled back, her heart pounding against her ribs. Panic began to set in. What had she done? She had only wanted to escape, to put an end to the nightmare, but now she had made things so much worse. Monique was dead, and it was her fault. The reality of it hit her like a wave, nearly knocking the breath out of her. She glanced around the room, her eyes darting from the blood-stained table to the shattered glass on the floor. She needed to think, needed to act. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let anyone find out what had happened. But how? What was she supposed to do now? Nia's first instinct was to call the police, but fear stopped her. What would she say? That she had accidentally killed the woman she'd been having an affair with? That her husband was missing, and she suspected Monique had something to do with it? There was no way out of this that didn't end with her life in ruins. Her thoughts spiraled, her mind consumed with images of her children, Olivia and Jackson, being taken away from her, her life as she knew it crumbling to pieces. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't let this be the end. Nia's survival instincts kicked in. She had to cover her tracks, hide any evidence that could tie her to Monique's death. Moving quickly, she grabbed a towel from the bathroom and wiped down everything she had touched. Her hands shook as she cleaned the blood from the floor, desperately trying to erase the horror of what had just happened. Every second felt like an eternity, and with each passing moment the panic in her chest grew stronger. But as she worked, she couldn't escape the creeping dread that no matter what she did, the truth would eventually come out. After what felt like hours, Nia stepped outside into the cool night air, her heart still racing. She had left Monique's studio as clean as she could manage, but the image of Monique's still form haunted her. The reality of what had happened weighed heavily on her, threatening to crush her under its unbearable weight. She didn't know if she had done enough to hide her involvement, but there was no turning back now. All she could do was pray that no one would discover the truth. The drive back to Baton Rouge was a blur. Nia could barely see the road through her tears, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind. How had everything spiraled so far out of control? When she arrived home, the house was dark and quiet. Her children were asleep, unaware of the chaos that had consumed their mother's life. Nia crept inside, her heart heavy with guilt and fear. She felt like a stranger in her own home, the weight of her lies suffocating her. How could she face them after everything she had done? How could she continue living this lie? She sank onto the couch, her mind numb with exhaustion. But even in the quiet darkness, she couldn't escape the fear that had wrapped itself around her heart. What if someone found Monique's body? What if the police came knocking on her door? The thought was unbearable. Days passed, and Frank's disappearance continued to dominate the headlines. The police intensified their investigation, questioning Nia relentlessly about her relationship with Frank. Each time, Nia played the role of the grieving wife, carefully crafting her responses, making sure not to reveal anything that could incriminate her. But the guilt gnawed at her, growing heavier with each passing day. Then, one afternoon, as Nia was sitting in the kitchen, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number, but the words sent a chill down her spine. "We know what you did." Nia's heart stopped. Her hands trembled as she read the message over and over, her mind racing with panic. Who was this? How did they know? She hadn't told anyone. She had been so careful. Her worst fears were realized when, later that evening, there was a knock at the door. 2 detectives stood on her porch, their expressions grim. Nia's stomach dropped as she invited them inside, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mrs. Turner," one of the detectives began, his voice steady. "We've received some new information regarding your husband's disappearance. We need to ask you a few more questions." Nia's mind raced. She nodded, trying to keep her composure, but her body was trembling with fear. "We've uncovered some evidence that leads us to believe there may be a connection between your husband's disappearance and a woman named Monique Jones," the detective continued. "We know you were close to her." Nia felt the blood drain from her face. Her worst nightmare was coming true. The walls were closing in, and there was no escape. "Mrs. Turner," the other detective said, his tone more pressing, "where were you the night Monique Jones was last seen?" Nia's heart pounded in her ears. She tried to answer, but her voice caught in her throat. She could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting for her to slip up. Her mind spun with panic, her lies threatening to unravel. In the following days, the investigation took a dramatic turn. The police uncovered surveillance footage of Nia's car near Monique's studio on the night of her disappearance. Witnesses had come forward, placing her at the scene. The evidence was mounting, and Nia knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The guilt and fear consumed her, driving her to the brink of madness. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Everywhere she went, she felt like someone was watching her, waiting for her to fall apart. She could barely look her children in the eyes, knowing that she had destroyed their lives. Then, one cold morning in late October, Nia's nightmare finally became reality. The police arrived at her door with a warrant for her arrest. The moment they placed the handcuffs around her wrists, Nia felt the weight of her choices crush her completely. There was no escaping the truth anymore. As she was led out of her home in front of flashing cameras and stunned neighbors, Nia's life flashed before her eyes. The love affair, the lies, the fear, it had all led to this. Her affair with Monique had spiraled out of control, consuming everything in its path, including her family, her freedom, and her sanity. Nia would stand trial for the death of Monique Jones, but the full truth about what had happened to Frank would remain a mystery. His body was never found, leaving Nia haunted by the question of whether Monique had truly been involved in his disappearance. The only thing Nia knew for certain was that her life had been shattered, and there was no putting the pieces back together.